Welcome, Mona Susan Power, and thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. So I'm excited both because I really loved the new book, but also because I've been teaching the grass dancer for a very long time.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I really like about both those books is that they are using nested stories as part of a broader narrative. So each novel begins in the present or close to the present when you were writing the book, before moving backward in time in each subsequent section. And this format is one of the reasons that I love teaching your work, because I get to help my students assemble this kind of narrative puzzle. With the grass dancer, we make a family tree on the whiteboard, and they start to understand the relationships between the characters. And they always have this aha moment that's really enjoyable for me to witness. Could you talk a little bit about why you use this technique in your novels?
Well, first, let me just say thank you. Thank you for everything you've done to support and promote my work, and for bringing me out to your school and teaching my work, and for this interview. I really appreciate that. And yes, and I should say I'm not the only writer, of course, to use that technique. There are a lot of, especially Indigenous writers, who have the polyphonic voices type of strategy, or I shouldn't even say strategy. I think it's coming just organically from this cultural idea of the importance of community and our place within a community. And so that just, that form kind of rose organically, I think, out of just our cultural heritage. But so specifically about the grass dancer, is that what you're asking me about? And
Both the grass dancer and the
okay.
Council of Dolls.
Um, with that one, I did not know. I wrote Moonwalk first. I wrote it completely out of order, that book. And I wrote this story, Moonwalk, just after I'd gotten out of the hospital. The vision that launched it was when I had to have emergency surgery. And so I was on morphine and I was in my hospital bed, and I had this morphine induced, or maybe not, maybe it was an ancestral induced vision of this woman in a gorgeous beaded buckskin dress who was bobbing at the foot of my bed. She was like dancing in place. And then she slowly danced closer to me, and I looked down at her feet, and I saw that every step she took, a little puff of some kind of like substance went up, as if she was going through sand or something like that. And so I said in my drug-induced haze, she's on the moon, she's dancing on the moon. Now, I'm not endorsing drugs in any way, shape, or form in terms of, launching a book. But that's just how that one happened. So I was curious once I got off the morphine, and I was in graduate school for creative writing, and I needed to write a story for workshop. And I'm like, I'm going to write a story about that woman and figure out what is she doing dancing on the moon. So that's where Moonwalk comes from. And when I finished writing that, I knew I was interested in Harley, her grandson, and what became of him. And I wanted to know more about her daughters. They were these twins, but they were so very different. And I thought, uh-oh, I think I'm writing a novel. And so it grew out completely out of order. I would just sort of focus on a character and then write something about them, whatever came forward. And at some point, I started to develop an idea of structure. I didn't wait till I'd already written each and every chapter. I started to think of the order I wanted to tell the story, and I decided I wanted to make a circle through time. So it does go backward, backward, backward in time, but then it loops forward at the end. And I wanted to bring the readers into a community, like as if they were invited to our community powwow. And I was sitting there like the gossip, saying, now that's the reservation witch, and that's, and just telling them a little bit about all these people coming together, hopefully to gain their interest, so then they would want to learn more about these people. And so I ultimately decided on that sort of strategy, to start there and then move backward in time. And both with that book and with this one, the reason I decided to go backward in time rather than have the story told chronologically is because I feel as if one major human issue that we have. It's the assumptions that we automatically come up with when we meet somebody or we hear a little bit of somebody's story. And the stories we hear are often leaving out a lot of important details. And so we can maybe harbor a lot of judgments about someone when we don't even know their story. And so I wanted people, like, for example, Mercury Thunder, the Reservation Witch, she's not a good person in the world, right? When we meet her. And while what happens to her that turns her to go like what I would consider a bad road, is really traumatic and sad. I'm not trying to excuse the choices she makes to go on that road, but at least we can have a little bit more compassion to know that she was someone who loved deeply at one time. She was a trustworthy person at one time. It's trying to have people judge others less. That was kind of the impulse for The Grass Dancer, to have people's assumptions about the folks they were hearing snippets about kind of shown to be shallow and not the full story. Same with Red Dress, Cuwignaka Duta. Whereas the impulse to use that strategy with the current book, Council of Dolls, was because, well, actually, I guess it is the same. We meet these parents who, some of them can be a lot. They can do things that aren't really healthy, and we might judge them a little bit. But then if we see them when they are a child, you start to think, oh, again, it doesn't excuse how they're behaving as adults, but you understand where it comes from. So you might have more compassion for them and judge them just a little bit less. Whereas I thought if I did it in chronological order, you'd feel sorry for these kids, but then when the book would towards the end, you'd see them behaving so badly, you might never get over that bad taste in your mouth. And I really didn't want to villainize anyone in A Council of Dolls. By the end, I'm like, oh, if there is a villain in this book, it's colonization. It isn't any of these. Okay, except for Sister Frances. Anyway, who's based on a real person, long dead, I think.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And that, I think that explains also why it teaches so well, because there is that element of surprise as my students have to reevaluate the characters that they know and how we got to that place. I read your recent New York Times profile, which was really interesting. There were just so many things I didn't know about your life, but I was especially curious about your description of A Council of Dolls. You say that this story is very much about healing, and I wonder how you see the relationship between that novel, which is telling such difficult and painful stories, and trauma and healing. Is it a kind of an act of faith that the healing that you found while you were writing is something that will also come through to your audience as they're reading the book?
That's one aspect of it for sure. I'm trying to, part of it is having this book out in the world allows me a platform to talk about healing and to talk about how it's worked in my life. And I don't mean I've arrived at this place where I'm all good forever and ever. Oh gosh, no, I can still get triggered, but I have come a long way. I am in a much better place than I was. It wasn't actually the book that healed me, writing the book. That came a few years before in the fall. I've been working on healing for years and years, not with traditional therapy, but I won't go into all that. It's a long story. Really the biggest breakthrough came, and I'd worked to set up that breakthrough. It's like, it didn't just come out of the blue. I'd been working towards the breakthrough for a long time. But it was a supermoon, like in the novel, the night of a supermoon, and it was September of 2019. And it was the month when I finally set down all of this shame, inherited shame, shame coming from both sides of my family. I think ancestors on both sides of my family, coming from my parents, on my own, just this toxic shame that had kept me hidden away for so long, depressed for so long, hating myself for so long. Even though, it's not like if I wrote down the bad things I've done, they're not that, I can have a bad temper sometimes and get in an argument with a dear person sometimes, but I mean, it's really not that bad. So the shame was sort of, it was, it really, it was coming from beyond me, from, I do believe, ancestors. And not that they wanted to hand that down, but they hadn't had the chance to complete their healing. And so, yeah, I, that's when my life started to turn around. So it's the fall of 2019, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to be out in the world again.
Oh.
Oh no, not yet, not yet. So, and then I have this terrible accident during the pandemic where I fall backwards, break my arm by the shoulder, can't use the arm, the hand, anything for a while. So I'm just writing like little flash fiction pieces that I can type with one hand. And but the idea to turn a short story I'd written into a novel comes to me via a dear friend of mine who read the short story about a year after it was published and said, this could be a novel. She's focusing on Ethel the doll. She said, you could have a novel about Ethel and Black protectiveness. And that's when that little idea started rolling around in my head. And once I got the go ahead from the doctor to start using the other hand to type, I started writing that novel. And it just flew out of me in 4 months. I've never written a book that quickly, ever. Now, I did do 2 more revisions later, so I don't mean, oh, and then I was done, but it just, I felt compelled to set aside the other novels I've been working on and just do that one. It was time. It was just time. It felt like and when I finished writing it, that first draft, which is the draft that I sent to an agent, the one who became my agent, it was May 26th of 2021. Just days later, they came across the grave of in Kamloops, at what had been an Indian residential school in Kamloops, Canada. They came across what they believed were graves of former Indian students there. And so I got these chills because, it was like not even a week later, I think, when that came out, and I felt, oh, this was the time. Not that other Natives haven't been writing about it, both in their scholarly work and in their creative nonfiction and in their fiction, but it's still not a lot. We haven't written about it a lot. There aren't so many books that you can find out there. And sometimes they'll just touch on it. You won't have lengthy scenes set in Indian boarding school. So I felt like, oh, that must be why I was guided to do that. Because I wanted to do the horror novels, the scary novels. I was like, no, got to do this one.
Wait, okay, I want to ask more about that as well. But yeah, I know what you mean. It seems like frequently, you're right, there's maybe a chapter or a reference to someone who was at boarding school, but it's just so powerful, particularly that reminder that it's intergenerational, right? That it's not even just one moment in American Indian policy. It's a moment that spans generations of lives, and that you have parents and children both going through that experience.
And that, yes, and that it continues even for the generations that haven't gone to these kinds of schools. And some of the Native readers I've heard from, it means so a lot to me. They'll say, oh my gosh, this could be my mom or my grandma or an uncle. They didn't understand where their behavior was coming from, and they knew they'd gone to Indian boarding schools, but they hadn't necessarily made the connection about some of the really unhealthy dynamics that they were contending with. And so, yeah, that means a lot that others are recognizing. It's helping them to understand. Oh, and that's the other thing that I wanted to say about why I felt it was important to put this history out there. I read the Goodreads reviews, and there are all these readers saying, why don't we know this history? We don't know this. But also, one of the characters, very intense character, I kind of tried to push out of the book. I didn't want to let her in, is the injured woman, the one who is an ancestor who shows up, appears to 2 of the characters in later generations. And she's a victim of massacres, and just, her wounds are just so horrific, and she works to keep them open. And I'm like, oh my God, like, I don't want to re-traumatize people or especially Indigenous people who have this in their family history. And, this is just too much. But she was insistent, and I'm an intuitive writer, and I trust my intuition. and she was meant to be in the book. And it didn't become clear why until more recently with the culture wars that we're going through right now in terms of what books are acceptable for people to read, what history is acceptable to be taught. And I felt that what the injured woman was showing us was that we can pretend to heal, if we have a severe physical injury, the flesh will form a scar and hide it, but you're never truly healed. That injury is always there with you unless you have processed it, unless you've worked with it and you've let go all of the pain, the emotional pain that came along with that injury. It's still with you. And if you die not having healed that, it's going to go on to the next generation. And now it's going to be their pain, even if they don't understand why they carry it. And so I felt, speaking to that whole thing of how the importance of telling our truth, speaking our truth, our community's truth, our multiple generations' truth, not just our own, but what happened to our ancestors, and to address it in this larger way within our communities, our families, within our nations. There has to be this sort of reckoning where people understand, yes, this is what happened. We cannot really heal that past without an honest, open, mature conversation about it. And at least that's I'm talking as if I know everything and this is the way it should be. I'm just saying that's where I'm coming from and where that character was coming from.
Absolutely. Thank you for being willing to share that. I'm just sitting here and processing it. And I guess I'm thinking, is there, so by that kind of process, I mean, the act of reading and discussing the novel can then become healing.
Exactly.
Is there,
for our country?
Yeah. Is there, I guess, and you can tell me if this is going a step too far, but I guess have you thought about, like, what would a bigger reconciliation look like? Like, is it just starting to have those conversations both in Native communities, but also more broadly across the United States? Is it something more concrete than that? Like, I mean, there's the land back movement. Like, is that,
Right.
I don't know.
I'm not comfortable speaking to this because my mother was the activist and the community organizer. I'm the arts person. So for me, it's coming from within me through art, and then I offer it up to the world. But I've never been good at organizing, or that's just not in my wheelhouse. So just in my own personal experience, which is where I'm coming from with this book, I know that in my family, cousins of my generation, so I'm almost 62, so cousins who are my age or maybe a little bit older, we're the children of these parents who went to these Indian boarding schools. We're starting to talk about the family dynamics and secrets. So for us, it starts with talking about our experiences, talking about our family, not hiding it away, not trying to be so overprotective. We're not saying, oh, they are bad people, or these are wounded people. Why were they so wounded? How did that come about? What work do we have to do to clear that away, not just for our own peace, but for their peace, so that they truly can rest in peace? And so I'm just sort of at that level, just because I'm such a shy, introverted person that,
Well,
I won't be like out there organizing, like, let's do this and that.
But art is activism, right? Particularly, I mean, that's one of
it's a different kind. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. You're talking a lot about your process writing, which I really enjoy hearing. And I have kind of almost a more practical question. So there are passages in the novel where Jessie is drafting and you're describing your writing process. I'm teaching a graduate writing workshop at the moment, and we end up spending a lot of time talking about writing habits and what that looks like, and helping graduate students start to develop their own writing habits. Would you talk a little about your own writing practice? Is it similar to Jessie's? How do you approach it? You said you wrote this novel, or the first draft of this novel, in 4 months. What do you do, I guess, when someone's not knocking down your door ready to tell the story?
Right. Partly because of depression. I haven't had a sustained writing practice for years. I'm always a writer. I'm always writing little pieces, but it was hard to summon the energy to be finishing many things, to really be able to every day do the work. Things have gotten so much better since that huge breakthrough in 2019. So, I've only finished the one book, but I've written a lot of short stories, and yeah, anyway, there's been a lot of other writing that's been going on the side, and I've been trying to figure out which of these three novels that are fighting for my attention. I work on one and I work on another, but yeah, I still haven't. I'm somebody that's slow, 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 and then fast. So once I find my way into a novel I'm working on, and I know I really have the right thread, I have the right structure, then I can write. I wrote half of Grass Dancer in 2 months.
Oh, wow.
I had a due date, and once I figured it out, it was like, it just, Sacred Wilderness took me 7 years. It took me years of doing research. But then once I figured it out, I wrote it again in 2 months. Like, so I'm slow until I know, until I've really got my hand on, but I do think that that's going to be speeding up now. I'm just more productive. I have more energy. I kind of, yeah, I have a lot of different projects, short ones and long ones, that are waiting for my attention. Right now things are busy because of promotional stuff, but I'm carving out space here and there for the writing time. For me, reading is one of the most important parts of my being a writer. Reading a book that makes me feel like writing is just gold. And it's often a writer in a book that they're far from my own experience. My voice is different, my experience is different from theirs, but there's something about their writing that just, I'm so involved. I love it so much. I love their voice so much that it gets my creative juices going. So I'll keep a journal to the side where, as I'm reading their book, I'm having all these ideas and lines and things come from my own story or novel, and they'll be unrelated. It's not, I'm not taking lines from the book I'm reading, but it's just getting me going. And so it slows down the reading because I'm going back and forth and back and forth. But yeah, I really value those writers who just make me want to write.
Are
So.
there, not to put you on the spot, but are there particular examples of that, particular books or writers that come to mind that have given you that kind of inspiration?
Well, for years and years, Louise Erdrich has been one of my main go-to writers in that way. But also Alice Munro. I
Mhm.
love Alice Munro's short stories. Her short stories are like novels, some of them. I mean, they just contain worlds and they're just brilliant. They break all the rules and yet they work. She'll do things that we were told in workshop you really shouldn't do, and she made it work. And so yeah, she's definitely a go-to person for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so because you've mentioned also your time in I assume in the Iowa Writers Workshop, right? Getting your MFA. I have to ask, you also though went to law school to Harvard Law, is that right?
I
Um,
did, and I understand now. I was trying to live my mother's dream.
okay.
She really would have been a fantastic lawyer. She just didn't have the academic opportunities. And so she really nudged me very hard, to stay away from the arts. I mean, in terms of trying to make a living, which I understand. And she, so it was really my mother's influence very much that pushed me to do that. But I'm just not. Yeah, I'm an arts person. I mean, not just writing, but I was a dancer. I'm a singer. We did a lot of theater, acting. I'm just not meant to be a lawyer. It's a very academic kind of field in a way. And I'm not, I taught writing, but I taught it like a writer. I'm not a scholar. I don't have that sort of, I have a very different way of thinking about things. And so, yeah, so once I figured out, okay, I have my law degree. I don't want to be a lawyer. I've been so privileged to have this opportunity to go to this law school, get this degree. But when you have that privilege, it's supposed to allow you to open more doors, not close them. So I worked for 3 years just in a jobby job wasn't in the law, so that it was 9 to 5, so that I could work on my writing. Because by then I figured out what I want to do. I'd always written since I was a little girl, but I wanted to get serious about it and see if I could actually become a writer. And so then after 3 years of producing a lot of stories, I applied to the Iowa Writers Workshop, and that was the only place I wanted to go. My mother had sent me this article about it in the Chicago Tribune magazine, and I just was like, it was like my mecca. And so I only applied to Iowa, and it wasn't hubris because I didn't think I'd get in. It's just that's the only place I wanted to go. And I told them that. And I was so lucky they accepted me. And I also told them, I have so much student debt from law school and college. I can't afford to go there unless I have help. And so they gave me this amazing fellowship. You know, it just, everything fell into place. It was like the universe said, yes, finally, this is what you're meant to do. Your mother's great, but she can't, you gotta live your own life.
Absolutely. Um, I wanted to circle back a little bit. You talked about how you have always written since you were little. And I've been thinking a lot about the dolls and the way in your book club guide you talk about how Ethel was inspired by your own childhood doll. And I really loved the detail about the ways that you and your mother packed your teddy bears so that they had air holes, and you like thought carefully about who was going into which boxes.
Well, she did that, you know.
She did the air holes, yes.
Yeah, she punched the ear holes and made sure that the ones that liked each other sat next to each other, and the ones that argued with each other were separated. It was really cute.
It is. Well, so as someone who also spent a lot of my childhood having conversations with my dolls, and the dolls are still at my parents' house, and you know, I bring them out for my son and he plays with them too. And so I wondered if you had thought about kind of I'm sure you've thought about the connections between the ways that you played with dolls and made stories with the dolls, and then the ways that you now tell stories as an adult. If that makes sense.
I haven't really thought about that specifically, but I was a psychology major in college, even though I wasn't interested in going into that field. Really, it's that my mother had taught me to so mistrust therapists and that whole that whole field, because she said, you know, they don't understand Native people. None of them are Native. And I mean, certainly back in the day, that was very true. And we still are so often pathologized and what have you. There are issues. So I desperately was trying to figure out unhealthy family dynamics on my own. So I figured, well, heck, I'll be a psychology major. And some of the classes I took, we had to write these in-depth papers about our upbringing and about our families. And it's interesting because I mean, may not be interesting. It was to the professor. I was talking about how I was this really generous kid who would be quick to give toys away or what have you to friends. But on the other hand, I didn't like it. Like I didn't allow people to cut my doll's hair, or like I was fussy about how they were cared for, and all their little things had to be organized. And what this professor said was, clearly you had one parent that was controlling every moment of your life, and you needed to have a realm where you had some control. The only control you had wasn't even over your body or yourself. It was over your dolls. So that was a safer world that you could have some agency in. And also writing. Writing was because some of it I would share, a lot of it I kept secret. That was the other world I found where I could be my real self and my authentic self. So yeah, there's a connection there between the way I played and strategizing how to navigate a wonderful parent, but a very controlling parent.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. I want to jump to one other topic. And this is something I'm really interested in, but I noticed in that New York Times profile, I think the author says that you politely reject the label of magical realism that some will impose on your work. And that's a term that my students are often eager to apply when we're reading your work. And I think particularly when they meet Mercury Thunder, they don't know what to do with her. I teach in Georgia, and most of our students are non-native, and this is a whole new way of thinking about the world for them. But it's also something that I'm interested in this distinction between magical realism and maybe Indigenous knowledge through my own research into Indigenous science fiction. And so I guess I would love to hear more about how you think about that distinction or why you reject that term.
That's a great question. And I know I'm not alone that I've heard from South American, Central American, African authors from other parts of the world who get stuck with that label. And they're like, we're just writing out of our lived reality. It might not be the Western, academic reality, but it's our reality. So it can be annoying. Where I'm coming from is never to say that I am right in my beliefs. I don't know. I believe in ghosts. I've seen ghosts, as my mother did, as many of my friends have. Do I know for sure that they are spirits of the dead? No, I don't. There could be other explanations. I don't know. But calling them a ghost, seeing them in that way, makes sense to me. And it's how I was raised. So that informs my reality. But I would never try to convince someone else, oh, you have to believe this too. I only ask that they allow space for the reality of someone else, especially when it's in that spiritual realm. I'm not trying to talk about looking at the exact same fact and saying, yeah, I'm not trying to get to that whole political thing there.
No.
But also, with the love medicine, and the way it's misused by Mercury Thunder in The Grass Dancer, I grew up being warned about certain people who practiced good medicine or bad, or not good medicine, bad medicine in the community. So it was this thing that people just believed in and just took for granted. And there was one woman who was known for her love medicine. And my mother would always make sure to find out what dish that woman put out for a feast, and then show it to my father and say, whatever you do, don't eat any of her food. It was just this accepted sort of thing. So yeah, that was our reality in our community. So I'm not trying to be woo-woo or supernatural. For us, it wasn't supernatural. It was just, some people have medicine, they know how to use it. You have to be careful what you do with your hair. When you comb your hair and you have some hair come out, you have to be very, very careful how you dispose of it. You don't want your hair getting in the wrong hands. So yeah, all of that is just familiar turf for me.
Makes sense. Thank you. I think that's the conversation I try to have with students, but the way that you say it is so much more eloquent. So I'm going to point them to you in the future. And then you talked a little bit about books and authors who inspire you to write, but I wonder what books and authors you see your own writing in conversation with. Like, are you thinking about A Council of Dolls entering into specifically a landscape of Native literary fiction at this moment, or in other kinds of spaces? Like, where are you?
See, that's getting scholarly to me.
I'm sorry.
That way. I know there's nothing wrong with that. I love that. Like, I like taking classes where I'm like, oh, it makes me look at this in a different way. To be truly honest, like, I could make something up. I don't think that way. I just don't. My book is my book. Books I love are books I love. Some of them are native, some of them are not native. I hope that's okay.
Yes,
and it's
of
not
course.
Like, I appreciate those. And I really hope it doesn't sound like I'm putting down, like I took literature classes in college that were fascinating, and I loved it. Because my brain doesn't think like that.
I guess what I want to say is that I follow your social media, and you're constantly, I appreciate how constantly you're drawing attention to other people's work and lifting them up and recommending them. And you mentioned that you're having a conversation about Linda Lagarde Grover's work later today. And so I guess I'm almost thinking, not even necessarily in this academic sense, but I hear that that's there, but in like a community kind of sense. Like, do you see yourself as a part of this kind of community of writers? That's what it seems like.
I do, although Right now, a lot of the people I've been promoting on Facebook have been a native, just because we suddenly have more getting published. But really, over the years, it's people of all different backgrounds, you know, African American, white American. It's so I see myself as like a Minnesota writer in a community in Minnesota. I see myself as parts of a lot of different communities of writers. There's some Indigenous writers whose work I love, but I don't necessarily feel our writing is at all coming from the same place. You know, our voices are different, our strategies are different. I think what we're trying to do is different. um like, for example, it was, I met Tommy Orange in April. We did several events together, and we hit it off so well. And my mother would have said that's because he's Cheyenne and we are allies, former, you know, Dakota and Cheyenne, they're our relatives, you know, so we can trust them. And you know, I feel like we're so different, our voices are so different, and where we're coming from is so different. But it was so much fun to, you know, to just talk shop. And so, you know, we're both Indigenous writers, but I think we're so different. Whereas probably one I feel I'm more not similar to in some ways would be Oscar Hokia. And you know, and we're all doing this polyphonic, you know, multiple voices, but I don't know. There's, and see, I'm not good at explaining why, because it's all feeling for me. It's intuition.
Yeah.
And I used to feel stupid because I had a hard time describing some of this. And then I realized, oh no, your intelligence works differently. It's not so much intellectual. It's emotional and intuitive. And that's fine. It's just different.
I mean,
But it makes it difficult for me to talk about literature. Yeah, for that reason.
but it's that everything you're describing is there in your writing, and yeah, that
Okay.
makes perfect sense. I don't want to make you feel badly in any way.
Oh no, you're not at all.
Okay, good.
I would give you a mean look if you were.
Oh no. Then I'll have done it all wrong.
I would chase you with my earrings. I don't even know what that means, except that I've been up since 3:30 in the morning.
Okay, I have one follow-up question, and then
Oh no, I'm not. No, that wasn't. I'm enjoying this, so I'm just teasing at you.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
You're probably, I'm sure you're used to native teasing by now.
Yes, I am. Um, um, you mentioned something about wanting to work on the horror books, and as you're talking about this, so you're talking about, you know, where you do and don't have similarities with Native writers, and that's, I know you said you don't think about it in an academic way, but I teach Native American literature classes, and that's one of the conversations we're always coming back to. And I often teach Stephen Graham Jones, who writes Native horror and who very much would not like to be considered Native first, right? That's not what where he wants to be coming from. I guess this is partially to say, I absolutely hear what you're saying. I hear other people saying it too. It's such an interesting place to sort of, to think about this tension of, well, we tend to organize around something like an ethnic identity, but obviously there's a huge distinction between lots of different Indigenous peoples and nations. So it doesn't always make sense to put them in one category. I like the idea of thinking about you as a Minnesota writer, as a different kind of space. I would love to hear more about the horror novels that you're thinking about, whatever you're willing to share.
Oh, sure. So I have 3 of them. And I've written quite a bit on each one of them. And one section of one of them was published, about a 9,000 word chunk was published in Plowshares. It's available on Amazon as a solo, in their solo series. It's called Goodreads Warrior. So I don't think there's anything spooky in that section, but it's within one of the spooky books. So I have one called what is it called? This is just the working title. I'm not saying this will be the ultimate title. Harvard Indian Seance at the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast. And that one I started working, or I first thought of in 2014. And then in 2017, I received a fellowship And so with my dear Choctaw sister, amazing writer Leanne Howe, and amazing Ojibwe, a visual artist Andrea Carlson, we had this adventure where we spent the night together at the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast. I rented it out using that money, but we also did a whole tour throughout Massachusetts, going to different places, including Salem, Massachusetts. So I was doing research, but we were also having like a fun girl trip. And so that one is about 5 Native students at Harvard. They're all class of 2013. And they're about to graduate. And for their last, and they're all of different tribal nations. For their last hurrah together, they want to do something crazy. So they're like, hey, let's spend the night together. Let's rent out the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast. And only one of them comes from money. She's the Hollywood Indian. Her parents, well, anyway, I won't go into those. But so she is able to afford it. So she does this. But several of these 5 students, they've got traumatic things in their background that they haven't dealt with. Some of it's their own trauma, some of it's going back farther. And it's sort of like bringing their stuff into that space that's already a disturbed space because of the murders that happened there in 1892, like brutal murders that happened there in 1892. They stir up the place and the place stirs them up. And it really doesn't look like anyone's going to make it out alive. And so there's that one. Then there is one that is about it's inspired by my experience. Twice now I've done a month-long writer in residence retreat in Sitka, Alaska. Both times it was in January because I was on break from teaching, but also it's in rainforest territories. People were like, going there in January. It's like, no, it's like Seattle. It's like Seattle. It rains a lot. It's not, and I can write there like crazy. It's too intense a place for me to live, but if I did, I would be so prolific. I would have 5 more books at least by now. And the first time I was there, I stayed at this beautiful contemporary apartment because it was funded by a wealthy organization. The second time, I didn't have that level of funding, so I stayed in what had formerly been a girls' dormitory in what had been an Indian boarding school. It then later became a college, but it had been shut down for years, boarded up. They had just taken off the boards and were refurbishing the buildings to turn it into a fine arts camp. But my collaborator and I were the only 2 people living there that whole month, the only 2 on the campus, the only 2 in that building, although not the only 2. It was so haunted. And it got really bad that we weren't sure we were going to be able to stay the whole month. And then we reached out. There were some writers we met there, and they hosted us for an evening, and we felt comfortable enough to start talking about that. And they were like, oh, we were worried about you. Some of them wouldn't even cross that campus at night, just walk across, let alone live there. So I started writing this ghost novel about, these artists who are staying in that kind of place, and how that it got really scary at times. And then I have the Year of Fury, where a Lakota woman who becomes immortal. She doesn't want to be, but at some point she just gets stuck. She's not a vampire. It's just she's not aging. She hits a certain age, and she becomes a kind of, I don't know, like a protector, but is a bit violent. She like rights wrongs. And so her name is Fury. I mean, that's been her nickname. She's pretty intense. I love her to death. She has this tortie cat. I often have animal characters and bird in Council of Dolls. I fell in love with my emotional support bird. I mean, fictional, but it felt like he turned up in the book to become my emotional support bird, the cockatoo prince. And it felt like every time I was hitting a rough spot in that chapter, he would show up and crack me up, and I just let him run a little bit, to settle me down.
Is there a difference between like the ancestor in A Council of Dolls who you talked about, who keeps her wounds open, and these other characters that I guess, where do you see the distinction, or do you see a distinction between that kind of character appearing in A Council of Dolls, and then these other books that you're specifically referring to as horror, because they both are about ghosts as a result of traumatic events, right?
Sure. I don't think though that A Council of Dolls in its entirety is it would never be classified as horror, I don't think. So I just don't see it in that light. I think partly because it's, even though it is fiction, I made certain choices, character choices, that helped me to make a leap into fiction. A lot of it is very close to home. A lot of it's very familiar territory. Even some events in the book are things that really did happen. I might not have known all the details, so I had to invent a fleshed out scene. But a lot of it is informed by real experience. So, and I don't want to think of my family as like
No,
a
no,
horror
no.
show. So no, I'm just saying. So I
Yeah.
just see it so differently. But I've always liked spooky stories, spooky films, spooky books, and my mother did too. We always were going to go to all the scary stuff, and so yeah, I don't think, today horror is getting really complex and all this. I like just the old school ghosts, and I'm not one of those. I mean, that can be great. I'm nothing against it, but I'm a fan of kind of more old school stuff. The old school vampires, the old school ghosts, the old school werewolves.
I guess, do you feel like there's a particular reason that you have 3 projects and they all happen to be horror when that's not a genre that you've published in before?
It doesn't surprise me at all because I always wanted to write something spooky. It just felt like I wasn't allowed to. And now I feel like, okay, I do feel that my writing in some way has to be about healing. I mean, even The Grass Dancer, the way it ends, it's about these young people being able to step away from some unhealthy dynamics in their lives, finding their own voices, sometimes literally finding their own voices. There's always a healing aspect in Sacred Wilderness. It's all over the place in terms of spiritual healing and connecting. And but even in these scary books, the healing theme is there too. So I feel like, okay, I think I should be allowed to write this as long as I make sure that's in there. I write endings first a lot of well, maybe not first, but early on. So for all 3 of them, I've written the endings. I just haven't figured out with each of them how to get there, so yeah.
Well, I'm very excited to read them when they come out into the world.
Oh, thank you. And please, I hope, I was really teasing, and I really value scholarship and academic analysis. I have a lot of respect for that. Have learned a lot, as a psychology major. It's just, it's not my way of thinking. So I hope it didn't sound like I was putting you down ever in any way. It was
No.
me just teasing, going, I can't go there. I don't know.
I'm also married to a creative writer, so I am familiar with the differences there as well. But no, not at all. I'm glad to be teased, and it's good for me to remember that the ways that I'm approaching the work and teaching the work is not necessarily the way that you're thinking about the work. It really helps me to hear your perspective and your process. It just, particularly A Council of Dolls, I know you're getting so many rave reviews, but it just feels so deeply personal. And I'm sure, I know part of that is because some of it is autobiographical, but it just feels like the book feels like a friend. It feels so familiar, even though it has nothing to do with my experience. And I really appreciate that talent and the way that you're writing.
Well, thank you. I think part of it is an emergence, part of my healing and not being self-loathing anymore, which took a lot of work. I was reading Buddhist authors, even though I'm not Buddhist, to help retrain my mind, because I have a very chattery little my brain's always, my mind is always thinking, talk, and the script is always running in my head. And but it was so mean to me, so mean and negative. And if we're struggling, it's like it would just throw acid on top. Well, of course that would happen to you because you deserve that. Well, it was just, it was so horrible and cruel. And but with the help of these Buddhist writers, I would gently correct that. And it took years of gently correcting that voice and saying, no, da 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 da, and saying something supportive. And finally, when I get to the year 2019, I'd done it for so long. I had rewired my brain, maybe. I don't know. And now I had an ally. I was my own ally. And now I could even take more responsibility for the mistakes I did make because my ego wasn't involved, because I really valued and loved myself. Just for, we all have worth. We just don't all believe that. And I know that's very gag worthy, corny, but there, for me, it's a deep truth. And with that came authenticity. Not that I was running around pretending to be someone I wasn't, but I was hiding a lot. And once I opened up and could be like, yeah, I can talk about, I wrote an essay about my one serious suicide attempt in 2003. It's in an anthology. It's been published. It was written about in our home paper, because they appreciated that essay. And I never thought I'd be able to go public with something like that. But it was in an attempt to be helpful to others who would recognize this journey. And I had nothing to hide anymore. And maybe that's part of what comes through in this book, A Council of Dolls, how personal it is, because I'm not hiding anything. I mean, I'm not trying to overshare either, but that's why, but it's just, yeah, this is familiar turf for me.
Yeah.
Here's what helped me. Here's what I know. Take
Thank
it for
you.
what it's worth.
Thank you for your willingness to share and to be honest and to put so much out in the world. It's really beautiful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.